Stan Gibilisco here, proprietor and operator of amateur radio station W1 GV, Whiskey 1, Good Vibrations. I'm going to tell you a little analogy. It's kind of hard to put into words, but right now my brain is too muddled from prescription drugs to work the software that would allow me to illustrate it for you, and I'm not sure that the illustration would be any better than my words anyway. My words might even be better. So, here goes. This is about ionospheric propagation, and for an example, a good example, let's use the F2 layer, Foxtrot numeral 2, or the F layer, Foxtrot layer. It's about 200 miles above the surface of the Earth, I believe, and it is commonly responsible for radio communication on frequencies such as 7, 10, 14, and 21 megahertz, 18 megahertz. Sometimes it operates at frequencies as high as 50 megahertz, and it always operates at lower frequencies, but sometimes the lower atmospheric ionospheric layers block radio waves and keep them from getting to the F layer. But in regards to the F layer, consider that you're on 14 megahertz and you're talking with a faraway station, or Morse coding, CWing with a faraway station. The signal will bounce or reflect or refract from the ionospheric layer and reach that station only under certain circumstances. The angle of incidence has to be small enough, that is to say, the waves can't come off your antenna at too high of an angle, or they'll pass through that F layer and go off out into space. But if the angle of radiation is low enough, the signals will bounce off or refract through and be returned by the F layer and return to the Earth. That angle varies depending on a whole lot of conditions: the sunspot cycle, the time of day, the frequency, and other factors that we probably don't even know about. But I'd like to make a comparison. If you've ever gone underwater in a swimming pool with a relatively smooth surface, a few ripples on it, but not a lot, and worn a good mask, a good diving mask, and looked upward at the surface from underneath the water, you will see that above certain angles of incidence, you can see up into the interior of the room where the swimming pool is, the natatorium. But if the angle of incidence is low enough, if you look at a low enough angle at that surface of the water, you will see a reflection of what's under the water instead. And that difference, that angle, varies as the waves undulate on the surface, so that you get a kind of a fading effect within a certain specific range of angles. The best way that I can offer you to see this phenomenon is to go underneath the water with a scuba mask and do it yourself. You probably have as a kid. Anyway, a lot of you may not have noticed this if you're not swimmers, but if you are, you surely have. That's sort of the way radio waves propagate by means of the ionosphere. Particularly the F layer is a good example. Although that angle can vary with the ionosphere, it's always the same with water. But it's a good comparison, a good analogy of how radio waves can reflect or refract, depending on which thought mode you prefer, from that layer, which is represented by the water's surface, from one station to another. If the stations are far enough apart, the angle of incidence will be small enough, and you will hear the other station. But if the stations are too close together, then your signals will pass off into space, and or that station's signals will pass off through the ionosphere into space, and you will not be able to communicate. That's just an analogy that I thought was kind of interesting and very illustrative if you're able to imagine things in your mind's eye as I yammer at you. That's a very good illustration of how the ionosphere works. I think it is. Anyway, comments are open. Tell me I'm full of baloney if you want. Whatever. Stangibelisco W1GV, saying 73 and so long, which, regardless of mode of propagation, tropospheric, ionospheric, line of sight, moon bounce, or anything else, always translates in my native fist to da-da-da-da-da-da.